devout Catholics at worship. This is Manila in the Philippines. It's Asia's most Christian country, soon to receive a visit from Pope John Paul II on his Far East tour. The Pope will be visiting a country at a historic turning point. He's spoken out on human rights before in other places, but if he does so here, his words and his visit could change the lives of these men and women. The political situation is explosive, and despite the piety of the Filipinos, there's a strong current of violence. Violence that emerged when a pope last came here. The visit of Pope Paul VI 10 years ago. At the airport, a deranged man in the crowd tried to kill him. The would-be assassin was a foreigner, but the attempt still raised the Philippines' reputation for violent action. And today, conservative Filipino Catholics have grown to criticize their government's violent ways of suppressing dissent. But John Paul will still come, because this is a major Catholic outpost in Asia, a country with deep religious traditions. These can touch the face of fanaticism. Here, Catholic devotees whip themselves to absolve their sins. They do it every year. A medieval ritual, maybe, but it draws crowds. It, also, shows the passions that weave through events in this country today. The Philippines are a complex society. Spain colonized them, so later did the Americans. They're mostly Christians, but some are Muslim. A developing country with a developing country's inequalities. The ruler for 15 years, President Marcos. His wife, the powerful, much admired Imelda Marcos. Much loved and hated also. They project charisma. Marcos won't want the Pope to speak out on human rights, yet the president's opponents don't want him to use the papal visit to boost his prestige. That's a conflict that could envelop the Pope when he touches down in Manila.
Dreams thwarted for close to a century. We have had 100 years of solitude, a century of alienation from one another.
Marcos claims the sanction of history. When he clamped martial law on a disordered country, it was meant to be lifted within a year. That was 8.5 years ago. Only now has he removed that martial law label.
A social order in which the privileged of the few were enjoyed over the degradation of the many.
Marcos says he'd like democracy again soon. He's called presidential elections for May. He denies his opponent's charges that he lifted military rule with one eye on the Pope's visit, and that his grip on the country will remain as before. We asked former President Diosdado Macapagal if the lifting of martial law would undercut criticism from Marcos's opponents.
Definitely not, because this so-called lifting of martial law is only on paper, as indicated by the fact that when Mr. Marcos so-called lifted martial law, he announced at the same time that all the proclamations, instructions, decrees, orders, and acts which gave him dictatorial power under martial law will remain. And he specifically directed the armed forces of the Philippines to do the same things that they were doing before. So this is a paper lifting of martial law.
Why has Marcos lifted martial law? One reason could be the renewed prominence of former Senator Benigno Aquino, talking here last year. The military court had convicted him of murder, subversion. Aquino spent nearly 8 years in jail. Now he's free in America. He's promised to return once martial law is lifted. Many observers thought a recent Manila bombing campaign meant martial law would survive a lot longer. It hasn't. For diverse reasons, bombings like this grenade attack on the Philippines Technical Institute may even have hastened the end of military rule. All these factors have, in different ways, made Marcos feel he can prepare his succession. But to see why martial law has been lifted now also means understanding why and how it came to be, the scenario of disorder and repression. Before military rule, violent protests on the streets of Manila. Here, 6 students died. In 1970, over 1 million people in the country had their own firearms. Police officials checked confiscated weapons, 10,000 of them in a single depot.
L-5269.
Okay.
L-5469.
Yes.
L-53.
Okay. Tingnan mo. Walang pagkakasama.
L-4669.
Yes.
The smuggling of illegal arms and drugs, the growth of violent crime, and the parallel growth of police corruption. These were the jigsaw pieces, the puzzle that was the Philippines in the early 70s. Martial law was to bring them together into a different picture, a new society. Many Filipinos saw these images, and they looked for order to calm the chaos. When military rule came, all Filipinos felt it. Marcos banned strikes and demonstrations, dissolved parliament, suspended elections. He curbed the press, arrested and detained thousands of opponents. Marcos cited the threat from communists and from Muslim separatists. Marcos's opponents said martial law only made things worse. Christian army officers soon replaced the Muslim zone community leaders in the south. The South is where most of the Philippines' Muslim minority live, where they've maintained their own culture, their own lifestyle. Marcos has tried to isolate the most militant Muslims. He's offered an amnesty to Muslim guerrillas who surrender. The president and his wife even appeared at these Muslim celebrations in Manila last year, another gesture of reconciliation. But attempts to blunt the Muslim guerrilla movement haven't always succeeded. Many guerrillas wanted independence and still want it. They fought the government bitterly. Marcos negotiated with them, and those talks with the Moro National Liberation Front produced a ceasefire. Battles restarted and continued through to 2 years ago. The Moro guerrillas have hurt Marcos. In 10 years fighting, 50,000 people have died. The problem has eased. Ceasefire agreements, a referendum, and the amnesty have all helped. Marcos can point to these achievements, but his opponents deny there was ever a need for martial law. Former President Macapagal.
It was a manageable problem. It was a problem of public order. And all previous presidents, from Rojas to me, we were able to manage the problem. So there is no need, there was no need, and there is no need to proclaim martial law in order to cope with the so-called communist or NPA problem. The real purpose of martial law, and I, who have been engaged in national politics in the same period of time as Marcos, I am positive that Marcos declared martial law in order to extend his term of office in violation of the Constitution, which prohibited him from continuing in office at the end of 1973. So 1 year before that, in order to continue himself in office, he declared martial law. And that is the main purpose of martial law.
The Marcoses deny that charge. Their supporters say elections confirm their popularity. 3 years ago, the first martial law elections to the Interim National Assembly. There was alleged wide-scale election rigging in Manila, the only place where there was serious opposition. Marcos allowed opposition parties to participate. That was tough for Senator Aquino. He had to handle his campaign from a prison cell. The result? A landslide for the pro-Marcos New Society movement. For the president's supporters, a triumph. But for observers at home and abroad, Marcos had failed to give his regime the aura of democratic legitimacy. Marcos allowed freer debate for local elections nearly 2 years later, the first municipal poll in 8 years. But the opposition had been absent from the political scene in so many ways for so long. They held enthusiastic rallies like this one, but they made little impact. The result was another landslide for pro-Marcos forces. Marcos now says his 1972 martial law decree brought about a renaissance in political, economic, and social life in a dramatic revolution. Downtown Manila could be a symbol of that dynamism. But behind the high-rise blocks, there's economic unrest. And that may be a major factor why Marcos now focuses concern on the form of government to succeed him. He points to over 5% economic growth. But he doesn't add that last year's growth was the lowest for 6 years. The balance of payments shows a $2 billion deficit. That's primarily because of oil price rises, with the Philippines dependent on imports for 80% of domestic energy consumption. The government wants to reduce that dependency and develop alternative energy. But gas prices have risen 300% in 3 years. That's not all. Inflation's high, unemployment's rising. The minimum daily wage is just $2, and there's a $12 billion foreign debt. The oil price hikes have meant hundreds of firms have closed. There are still goods in the shops, but for many Filipinos, all this spells poverty. This is the face of that poverty, Manila's Tondo slums. The World Bank has just approved a $1 billion development loan to the Philippines. And it discussed plans to lessen widespread poverty here. They include a food project. The goal? To eliminate malnutrition by 1990. Marcos may hope that moves to a more acceptable form of government will encourage more international aid. And that could benefit the Tondo inhabitants. One factor makes the transition to even limited democracy look more urgent. There's been speculation about Marcos's health. He makes many public appearances like this, but some people say he's ill. Will there be a peaceful transfer of power when Marcos goes? In the Philippines today, observers see no political structure to provide a replacement figure. And yet the time may be safe for change. Military rule has neutralized the hardest kernels of opposition. Government agencies have infiltrated the student movement. Labor unions are weak. Against this background, Marcos has prepared for lifting military rule. He's now begun to give his new society movement at least the form of a nationwide political base. The Filipino people also may now want change. Many resent what seems like endless martial law. They allege political corruption. And they say the Marcoses have profited financially from the privileges of power. Overseas, too, governments express concern about Marcos's fragile political base. He can't ignore that. His country depends much on foreign, especially American, trade and investment. And both the United States and Manila's Southeast Asian partners fear that the vertical power structure Marcos heads is vulnerable to domestic forces. These countries often cite alleged brutality and power abuse in the Philippines. That must be still another reason for Marcos to prepare for the future. The U.S. has reason for special concern. It has bases here. An accord 2 years ago maintained the level of U.S. military and development aid, and it confirmed the status of the U.S. bases. These are strategic positions geared to a rapid deployment force, the American thrust for the 80s. It's reported President Reagan reassured Imelda Marcos on her recent Washington visit. The Philippines will remain a major strategic American ally. The Carter administration pressured Marcos on human rights. President Reagan's emphasis may well be elsewhere, on military aid. Pressure from the U.S. must have influenced Marcos. He admits his priority has been to remove the label of martial law. But if the Americans buttress his regime, so do the generals at home. He knows it's important the Filipino armed forces feel their authority is intact. The military have been privileged under martial law. Some say too much. There's been abuse, evidenced in fighting Muslim and communist insurgents. It's now vital for Marcos to keep the general support. He'll walk this delicate tightrope between Washington's call for reform and his army's call for authority. He won't want a sudden transfer to civil rule. But there have been still other signs of the need to identify alternatives to the Marcos regime. Last year's Manila bombs were one face of a possible political vacuum. No one liked what they saw. This bomb wrecked a discotheque. Others hit vital tourism and foreign investment targets, from hotels to banks. The government says it knows who the terrorists are. Marcos feels the bombings are now under control. But some observers believe he's tried to discredit the legitimate opposition by linking them with terrorist violence. The guerrillas are anti-communist. Their ideologies differ. They say they want to scare, not assassinate. But they may only have given Marcos the pretext he needed to strike at major dissident figures, who liked the terrorist goals, but not their methods. Arrest orders have seemed aimed at suppressing those opponents, rather than catching the bombers.
That is one of the major concerns of the opposition.
The failure of opposition at home means many Marcos critics are now turning to the U.S., where Senator Aquino says he may return from exile. Speaking here before he left the Philippines, Aquino announced he'd be willing to talk to Marcos. Today he says he's still willing, if the terms are right. He's skeptical about Marcos's proposed May presidential poll. He doubts it'll be a free election. The Marcoses let him fly to Texas last May. He needed heart surgery. But in the U.S., he soon broke his promise of neutrality. He's organized anti-Marcos activities. If Marcos figured Aquino was less harmful free overseas than imprisoned at home, he was wrong. Last summer, Aquino warned of urban guerrilla war in the Philippines. Soon after, the bombing began.
Then we'll never go forward. We'll never solve our national problems.
Marcos may regret the day Aquino left Manila Airport for the U.S., for he now says Aquino's behind the American connection with exiled dissidents. Aquino himself approves the terrorists' goals, if not their methods. He's talked with terrorist leaders. So far, Philippine opposition hasn't united behind him. For Aquino's also ambivalent about Marcos. He even speaks of Marcos with some admiration. Many say it's primarily their personalities that differ. For Aquino himself admires a Gaullist-type government model. Authority, but with democratic guarantees. He's as pro-American as Marcos. He's even said he'd help Marcos once martial law was lifted. That must make the Philippine opposition think twice. They know Aquino has no real mass base, no armed force behind him. At this press conference, the heads of two moderate opposition parties formed the United Democratic Opposition. They haven't waited for Aquino, though they know he could give them real credibility. One major opposition weakness has always been their failure to present a unified alternative program. Now it's possible they could offer a real option to Marcos's authoritarianism, a choice, as they say, between dictatorship and communism. Former President Papal believes the opposition can now challenge Marcos.
Unity of the opposition, and I have had some experience in this, need not be and cannot be total, because there can be no complete unanimity in any group. That would be totalitarian. In a free society, you cannot have unanimity. So what is meant by united opposition is substantially united opposition. And I have particularly exerted effort towards this end, and we have already established three stages of united opposition. Now, the latest one is the United Democratic Opposition, or the UNIDO. This unification of the opposition is more than substantial for the purpose of challenging the legitimacy and the authority of this present martial law regime. So it would seem that we can achieve what we have been organized to achieve.
The magnitude of
Marcos
this moment
believes he's above
necessarily
any
brings us
challenge.
back to the very first crisis in the life of our people, when nearly a century ago our forebears in Pugadlawan, Tiradpa, the ways of an authentic democracy, in Malolos, offered their lives, their happiness, and most valuable of all, their sacred honor to a quest that we pursue to this very day, the great quest for a new society.
Military rule did cause protest while it was in force. Yet now it's been lifted, many Filipinos feel things will be much as before. For Marcos has laid the foundations for authoritarian rule to continue. There could still be demonstrations like this. In November, just 2 months before he lifted martial law, Marcos signed a decree expanding powers of arrest, search, and seizure. Early January, he signed new measures he could use in grave emergency. They mean he can close schools, shut down the press, limit public assembly, imprison people at will. All this even without martial law. If there are National Assembly elections, constitutional amendments allow Marcos to remain Prime Minister by right. That's the background to the lifting of military rule. Few observers expect the move to change the lives of this country's 49 million people. In theory, the lifting of martial law allows free speech, a free press. It abolishes detention without trial, dismantles military courts. Yet detention without trial will continue in the South, and it'll apply everywhere in cases of subversion. There may be more student political actions, like this recent anti-US rally. And Marcos has now freed many political prisoners. Yet military chiefs say they'll still hold suspects as long as they want. Strikes in many industries will still be illegal. Media councils will still oversee press content. The regime controls newsprint supplies, and it can influence business advertisers. So that freedom will be relative. If there's so little change, how will Filipinos react? Or is this just the beginning?
But it all depends on Mr. Marcos. If Mr. Marcos still clings to power, his plan now seems to be still in power by 1984. That means he will have been in power for 20 years. And then he hopes to run for assemblyman from his province for another term of 6 years. That means that he will have stayed at that time by 26 years. Now, if he persists in clinging to his position by force, then there is no other remedy for the people except to do everything that they can in order to restore democracy in this country. So it all depends on Mr. Marcos whether there will be a violent or peaceful transition.
The long-term picture is as yet confused. Marcos's goal may be to transfer power to the National Assembly. That could lead to assembly elections. Leftists would probably be banned, but many would prefer that solution to a military junta. Senator Aquino has welcomed the lifting of martial law, so this could be a test of Marcos's commitment to an open society, to amnesty Aquino, to allow him to return to Filipino political life. A state of much uncertainty. That's how it is in the Philippines on the eve of the Pope's visit. Worshippers may look to the Pope for words of reassurance. They may well pray for solutions that are, above all, peaceful. The next few months should provide some answer to political uncertainties, here, where the personality of President Marcos is so closely interwoven with his country's future.